I'm here at D-Day Conneaut in Conneaut, Ohio. It's the largest D-Day reenactment, I believe, in the world. And in addition to the big battle reenactment that we do on this big beach, there's a huge camp filled with reenactors setting up displays, educating the public about history, and representing the past. So today I want to walk around, talk to some of these reenactors who are representing different groups from World War II, and get their stories about what they're representing, the history of those units, and hopefully we'll learn something from all of them. Before I show you guys the impressive displays I saw at this reenactment, I'd like to quickly thank Sonoran Desert Institute for sponsoring this video and supporting my work on this page. With more than 350 million firearms in the US, the time has never been better to learn how to be a gunsmith. Sonoran Desert Institute offers online firearms technology education with hands-on labs and materials shipped right to your door. Course topics range from AR-10, AR-15, or 1911 armor options to shooting sports management, ballistics, gunsmithing, and more. Get your education and turn your passion for firearms into a successful career. Visit sdi.edu through the link in the description or call 480-999-4767 to get started. Thanks again to SDI. Now let's get back to D-Day, Ohio and check out the first display.
Matt Payson with the 2nd Naval Beach Battalion recreated here. And what we're doing is we're recreating a signal section of one of the Navy beach battalions. These were essential to every single amphibious landing, whether it was North Africa, Sicily, Normandy, and then again in the Pacific you had beach parties and beach battalions. They're little known guys, but at the same time they were extremely crucial jobs. So what these guys did, they were one section of one platoon. They would have your signal section. You would then have hydrographic section, which puts out beach markers and different things like that so the boats know where to land. These guys are communicating from ship to shore. And you think about it, you have hundreds to thousands of ships out there and they all have troops that have to get ashore or supplies, anything like that. You have casualties that need to be evacuated. Also, the supplies, material, men, vehicles, these guys are coordinating all of that. So in Normandy especially, there was, at the final count after about a month, there was over 100,000 troops that they brought in over Utah Beach, where these guys were, the 2nd Beach Battalion. They brought in tens of thousands of vehicles, tens of thousands of prisoners of war they shipped out, tens of thousands of casualties as well. So these guys, they would, a little bit of everything. Again, they had communications from ship to shore, coordinate between the Army and the ships. They would have corpsmen and doctors treating all the wounded on the beach. But it was a really unique job because they would have to land in those initial waves with those assault troops because, especially in Normandy, there were so many thousands of beach obstacles and different things like that. And so they had these guys land at low tide with some of the other assault troops as the demolition crews who were also Navy on the from the water side up to the high water mark, working alongside engineers, Army engineers. They blast gaps through the obstacles, and then these signal guys would come in and try to flag in some of the boats. The hydrographic guys would set out markers, at least according to plan. But as they found out on Omaha Beach, where the 6th and 7th Naval Beach Battalions were, things did not usually go to plan. A lot of this equipment they're carrying ashore got lost in the surf. Casualties were very high, but these were the guys on that beach there who were helping. Some of the first medical guys were from the beach battalions who were there on the scene to help treat wounded. You then had men whose job it was to clear out wrecked boats, the boat divisions, boat sections, and different things like that. But so normally a lot of us here, we were members of various groups, but we also are members of the living history crew on the USS Massachusetts in Fall River, Mass. We portray many different things, but Navy for a lot of us has a special place, whether it's for relatives or just an interesting part of the war that's usually overlooked. But you know, very vital role in the war, whether it's Pacific or Europe theater. Both the guys on the ships, getting everybody there, getting all the supplies to and from, but then also these guys who were going in with the Army guys and making the beaches and the invasions actually happen. So.
My name is Melanie Oringer. The guys here call me Dicky. as an honor to Dicky Chappelle, one of the brilliant World War II female war correspondents who covered the war partly in the Eastern Theater and over in the Pacific, and went on to cover many, many wars, and has the horrible distinction of being the very first female war correspondent who died in combat in Vietnam in 1965 when a soldier next to her stepped on a mine accidentally and killed them both. But they call me Dicky because she was amazing. So I'm here with the 165th Signal Photo Company. They were detached to the first ID to talk a little bit about these amazing women who participated in covering the wars on both sides of the ocean and were made history because they were the first to actually do it. There are about 139 women in total who actually finally received credentialing from the forces, all of them, Marines, Navy, Army, and Air Force, who spread out across the world. A lot of them were told they thought they were going to just be covering backstories, hospitals, humanitarian things, but a good portion of them would make their way into the combat zones. In 1935, Margaret Bor White, who worked for Life magazine, was the first female ever to be made a photographer and correspondent for a newspaper. In 1940, she and Lee Miller, who had been a model, a beautiful woman, who got bored of modeling and asked a photographer to teach her how to take the pictures and be behind the camera. So they were in London during 1940 during the Blitz. They both were taking pictures at the time. Margaret Bor White sent her photos back to Look magazine, and they were the first ones to grace the cover to show the destruction and devastation and the cost of war, something that was rarely seen or talked about prior to these women being out in the field. There were some women who were sent just to write. Martha Gellhorn, who had been married to Hemingway, but by that point their marriage was coming apart and they both worked for Collier's. She was here covering the war as well. And she specifically said, somewhere I have a quote which I absolutely love, I will try to find it. She said, "I always thought if I could make anyone who had not seen such suffering begin to imagine the suffering, they would insist on a world which refused to allow such suffering." And so that was one of the reasons these women were hell-bent on being where they were. None of them were forced to be where they were. They all begged to be where they were. Dicky Chappelle, who the guys call me, she was about so big. She was a little nearsighted. She had an MIT degree in engineering. She'd been a wing walker and a barnstormer in the early days, and married an older man. When war broke out, she just simply told him, "I have to be there." And he said, "Okay." And off they went. In Okinawa, the guys said that when they saw her, you couldn't tell her from a guy. The way she was dressed, her hair pinned up, loaded down with all kinds of gear, and you would have never known. As a matter of fact, there's a story that says that a group of the enemy surrendered to her camera, and she marched them back into camp. It's quite amazing. She was a very brave woman. Margaret Bor White has a famous story for having been in London and wanting to cover. She was the very first female correspondent who was actually given credentials to be in combat. A lot of the women had to schmooze their way into combat. All the correspondents, male and female, came in at officer rank so they could mess with the officers, eat with them. They tried to schmooze their way into getting passes. When that didn't work, they would just go off and go to the motor pool, make friends with the guys who took care of the jeeps, and they would let them sneak into jeeps and vehicles to get to the battlefield. A lot of the commanders hated having the women. It was like, "We don't want them here. I have no place. I have no latrines for them. I have no place to, for them to shower. And I don't want my guys to have to pull up their pants because there's a girl in camp." And Dicky Chappelle simply said, "I'm not here for that. I'm here to cover the war." So they didn't wear makeup. They had their hair cut short. They lived just like the men in tents. They rolled around in the mud. Lee Miller got her credentials in 1942. She mostly back covered nurses, hospitals, the devastation left behind. But they sent her off to a place in France after D-Day when they thought the battling was over, and it wasn't. And when she got there, she just simply threw herself into a German trench, and her foot slammed down into a severed hand. And she was just so angry that she picked up the hand and she threw it back out the trench at everybody, screaming at all the devastation that these ugly, bloody Krauts had rued upon this beautiful French city and people around the world. So you've got these ladies spread out everywhere with the bravery of covering these wars. A good portion of them. So Margaret Bor White, she worked for Look magazine. A lot of people that are watching this probably don't know what those are. In the old days, Look and Life were these amazing magazines, really big, a lot of photographs and stories to go with them, covering things around the world. Dicky Chappelle worked for Life magazine. And I think it was Look sent out 7 reporters and photojournalists, basically. And the word photojournalism came from these women because the men were sent a reporter with a photographer in tow, and the women were handed a camera. And they either wrote or they took pictures and wrote the stories too. So the word photojournalism arrived from that. All the other places, it was just single. And they were sent by themselves. They were never sent in groups together. They would find each other from other magazines and newspapers when they were in camps, if they were in the same place. All of the correspondents had to acquire their own gear, so you'll see mix and match of everything. They were not handed anything by the services. So they either bought it themselves or they was provided by their organizations that sent them. They really changed the face of not only how we look at the war, all wars, and the cost of them, but they also changed the face of how we look at women and the tenacity and their ability to keep going. So a lot of them continued after World War II to cover wars all the way through Vietnam. There is a famous photograph in Hitler's bunker of a beautiful woman sitting in his tub in the bunker with her boots on a white rug all muddied up. That's Lee Miller, and Lee Miller actually set that photo up, and she wanted to put a soldier in there, but they said, "Oh no, lady, you get in, this is your time," and they took that photograph. It's quite famous. I think it was Margaret Bor White was one of the first to be in one of the concentration camps, and they lived with that afterwards. Lee Miller had so much PTSD. Her son has written a book about how awful it was for her, and nobody even thought about that for these women. Women were not part of the men's press corps. They were not allowed to join the men's press corps. They had to create their own press corps, and it wasn't until the 70s that they were invited to co-ed that. Now, Martha Gellhorn, back to her. Brilliant woman. Just before D-Day, everyone was milling around England waiting for this to happen, as well as a group of women. I do have a picture of some of those women in their fancy gear. This one here is Lee Miller. So this is a group of them. There were 7 that we know of that were called the D-Day ladies. And they were pushing to go to cover this. I mean, you know, Martha Gellhorn said, I shouldn't have to beg to do my job, to tell the world what has to be told. And they were told summarily, no correspondents are going across, only the photographers with the military, until the battle is over. And so the men expected like a day or 2 later, they're going to be here on the boats. Women were told, no, you can't go at all. We're not letting you cross and come across. They were very angry. Martha Gellhorn said, hell no. So she sat there and she said, what's the first thing that comes down the beach when a battle's over? Well, it's going to be your ambulance hospital ship. So she managed to put on a nurse's uniform, got on with the staff, scuttled her way into a latrine, hid herself in that latrine all night waiting, and when they came to the beach the next day, out in the water, she scuttled off that ship, got herself to shore, and covered the end of the battle, okay? It was over. The shooting had stopped, but she was the first private reporter on the beaches, the first correspondent, male or female, got that story, got it back to Collier's. Day or 2 later, sitting out on the water, the guys come in, they all heard this news, and they were teasing Hemingway terribly. He was so angry he never left the ship. course, she felt that that's great. I love the fact that he's out there, won't come on shore. Problem was, his article graced the cover of Collier's and hers was hidden on page 17. But she has that moniker to her name to the forever and ever. As a result, she lost her correspondence credentials. Of course, she broke rules, she broke order, she went against what they were told. But she was so charming and she knew so many people, didn't matter. She managed to cover the whole war without them. So, you know, it's just this amazing group of women that so many of us know nothing about. When they see us in camp, they're like, what are you doing here? That's what we were doing. We were here telling the truth about death and guys losing legs and the devastation that gets left behind. It's not all rah-rah. And although they supported the troops and they supported the effort, they thought it was really important for the world to know what it is that happens, what we pay, the price we pay, with real hopes that we wouldn't do it again.
Hi, my name is Andrew Novak and I'm with 5th Rangers Baker Company here at D-Day, Ohio. My specific impression that I portray within the unit is actually a member of the 165th Signal Photo Company. And so those are essentially Signal Corps Army photographers that specialize in photographing war, photographing daily life as a soldier. So in the tent here I've got some basic kit and equipment that they would have had. Basic small cameras, large format cameras. Yeah, they were an integral part of D-Day. They landed on the beaches with everybody else. And I've read multiple stories of heroic photographers who had to carry out their mission just like everybody else, and so that oftentimes they would sacrifice their life, sacrifice limbs, just to take the pictures so that people could see what was actually happening. A very underrated group of guys in my opinion, but some of the most heroic men were photographers during the war. This is a Graflex Speed Graphic. This was the standard issue camera for enlisted men that were photographers. This specific one's missing a lens on it at the moment, but this is the military model with the blacked out nameplate. It's sitting on a original unissued Signal Corps tripod. Yeah, it's a large format camera. It's tricky to find developing and film processes for this style camera today. Back then, this was kind of the tried and true camera at the time. So that's a 1940s Royal typewriter. That's kind of the most common typewriter you're gonna see is the Royals. Very reliable, good quality typewriter. Back here, this is actually an original World War II mobile developing lab. And what they would do is you have all your fixers and other chemicals to develop your film, and you could develop them in the field if you had the proper darkroom tent. This setup here isn't 100% correct for that specific unit since it's not a darkroom tent. But I have it out on display there, and it's got an enlarger that you can attach onto there. Kind of a quick, handy way to develop in the field if needed.
Excellent. Hi, I'm Chaplain John Euler. Welcome to the World War II Chaplain exhibit here at Conneaut, Ohio. And just to kind of give you an idea of what we have here, we do have a original World War II chaplain communion kit. We have a chaplain's field desk. We have a hymn chest down there on the ground with the organ behind it. And the organ was a powerful tool for the chaplains. I don't know if we can kind of walk around this way a little bit, but if you kind of think about going to church in the 1930s when you were a kid, you would have heard a large pipe organ being played. And now you're nowhere near home. The history of this world has gotten a little dark, and instead of going to continuing your education in college or working at the factory down the road, you're suddenly found overseas. And a chaplain with his assistant could walk into the field, and I have an assistant who can play with this and make it sound really good. Now my assistant, when he plays, with all 10 fingers can make this sound like a large pipe organ. And now that poor soldier who's sitting in a field of misery can close his eyes and he is brought back to his church at home. That's one piece of equipment just with the field organ. The hymn chest weighs 96 pounds and holds 150 hymn books. And quite often the communion kit was just placed on the hood of the Jeep. And the chaplains would go from field to field and just hold services where the men were as they had opportunity. So the first and foremost duty of the chaplains was to meet the spiritual needs of the men that he served. He also did quite a bit to help with the morale of the men. He would also help with the wounded, serving as corpsmen and medics, as well as ministering in the hospitals. And all the way back home, there were chaplains for the soldiers who were wounded. But unfortunately, not all the men made it. So the chaplains also did a lot with graves registration and finding out what happened to this young lad, and then researching, finding out, so your son was walking point and a sniper hit him. And the men with him said he just went right to the ground. He felt no pain, but he is buried at, and they would give the document where the deceased was interned. So the family would have that kind of information. They also did a lot to help with just the ministry of the needs of the men in general. So it might be working with the Red Cross, the Salvation Army, either getting the soldier home, or, I'm sorry, you can't go home. I know that your dad doesn't know how to pay the bills now that your mom died, but I have somebody from the Salvation Army in your hometown who will go and teach your dad how to pay the bills, because we can't let you go home for that. So the chaplains were always busy ministering to the needs of the men. Basically, 1/3 of the chaplains were Catholic because 1/3 of the men were. You also had 2/3 of the chaplains approximately being Protestant. And then you also had Jewish rabbis who also served as chaplains. And you would have one rabbi who would serve over an entire division. Now, the men during World War II really didn't care who the chaplain was. If you're walking through a desert or driving through a desert and you've been driving for 8 hours and you're looking for an Italian restaurant and you come across a sign that says Mexican, guess what? You're happy for the food before you. I've talked to a number of vets and they didn't care who the chaplain was. They were spiritually hungry and they all went to the service. But chaplains have an obligation to either perform or provide. So there were certain things chaplains could and could not do. As a Protestant minister, I cannot perform last rites. So my obligation would be for somebody who's dying is to get a priest, whether it's a local priest or one of the other chaplains to administer those last rites. But they did try to pitch it for each other as well.
Well, my name is Elena Maynard. I am First Lieutenant of the 128th Evacuation Hospital. So my formal title for this weekend is First Lieutenant Maynard. And with the 128th Evacuation Hospitals, nurses would have landed June 10th of 1944. Here we have today a pre-surgery ward. For the echelon of evacuation, you would have your medic on the field with your units and divisions, and then from there you would be evacuated from the front lines to a battalion aid station, and from the battalion aid station a collecting station, and then a clearing station after that a couple miles further, and then adjacent from the clearing station would be a field hospital. Field hospitals where you see your first nurses. But the 128th was 5 miles from the front lines on June 11th 7th. They were ushered in rather quickly because their boat, the William Pendleton, was damaged by a glider bomb. So the nurses had to go onto the beaches early in June 10th, 1944. So from there, when they hit the beach master said, "Hey, you got to get out of here." They were confused because they didn't have their captain with them. So they went to the 42nd Field Hospital, and from there they cleaned the wards. So from there, the guys were very happy to see the women come into the 42nd and clean the wards and be able to, be a home away from home and see ladies finally. You're out there for months and months, weeks and weeks, or you may be new to the Army. You're in your trench and your foxholes, and you're around guys. So finally, you have to go back behind the front lines, and you finally get to see a woman. From the front lines, we would have patients, and the women treated the POWs just as much as they would the airborne or any other patient coming in to the hospital. So they didn't, they weren't jerks to them at all. Mm-hmm. They were very sweet, and a lot of them picked up on the British word, English, and started talking and said sweetie, called them sweetie. It was very sweet to read about that. But from there, the nurses, they worked 14 to 18 hour shifts. They were around 7 days a week, but of course there was 3 chaplains, so they would have church service and have some sort of R&R out in the field, but they slept in what you see back here, which are small walls, and they would have two to a wall tent, and then from there they would have a night shift nurse and a day shift nurse, so they would be coming in and out, so they weren't interrupting each other. And all nurses too had to learn everyone's job. So if a nurse fell down with malaria or an upper respiratory infection in like the fall time or any other disease, the nurses could go right into a POW ward, pre-op, post-surgery, or an anesthetist. So over here, one of the better items that I just received, that I just purchased and came in just for this event. I think the guy knew he was that I was a reenactor or something, but this is a 1940s thermometer, and a lot of times in pre-surgery they would check their temperatures to make sure they're not going into shock, and it also is a very common occurrence that even after surgery patients can still go into shock. So post-surgery was still vital in the resuscitation of the wounded, but from even an evacuation hospital, they were a semi-mobile hospital unit, so only half of their unit was able to pack up and leave, and then the rest of the orderlies and the trucks would come back for the administrative side. So they would have the hospital staff move first so they can be closer to the front lines, and it was about 5 to 10 miles from that. But coming over here, this is a rather strange contraption. Let me see if I can open it all the way. So this is a field pocket sterilizer. You would have oil burning here, and then your needles up here, and then you'd close it up, and it would sterilize your needles, and you can go on to the next patient. And for surgery, there was about 6 going on at the same time, and they would have specialized auxiliary hospital groups specializing in their area of specifications and stuff for surgery. So they would have plastic surgeries as well to help your skin, debridement of wounds and stuff like that. But over here you have your typical dressing. This is actually a sling that I made from some muslin as well. So just as reenactors, we just work with what we have, and we create we create our items sometimes from craft stores and sew and knit and all that. So from there, this is a 1940s blood pressure cuff. And I love how everyone is still so quiet. So what is a very good fact too, again with shock, is they would constantly check for vital signs every 10 to 15 minutes in a shock ward, and it would be around 80 degrees because with the loss of blood your temperature is dropping rather quickly. So instead of a fly here, you would be in like a pyramid tent so they can control that temperature, and one nurse and one orderly, or I would say tech, was in the shock ward at all times. And then over here, this is a anesthesia kit. You'd have all your items, your syringes as well. I have glass syringes. And I have my needles up here. So let me put one on here. And the 40s also screwed on. And everything was glass, everything was fragile. And this is what the nurses, this is a 10 cc glass syringe. So from the British to the American side and even to the German side, everything was glass. Everything was fragile, and for safety measures, I always tell people, my reenactors, to put them back, and when they're done.
Okay, hi, I'm Lieutenant Sanderson. I'm the leader of the 229th Combat Engineer Group, and this is my display. I'll go over a little bit of what we got here. Combat engineers did a little bit of everything: construction, demolition. We built sanitation systems, water systems, dug wells, repaired roads, repaired railroad lines, built barracks, other buildings, you name it, we did it. Now, we have a variety of things around here. This section over here is our, well, land navigation surveying system, or setup. I have a sextant that I could do land navigation inland. There were no GPS back in the day. A transit for doing surveying work. And we also made maps. This section here, we got a variety of different things. The SCR 625 mine detector. And then a variety of explosive devices, different types of demolition charges, and the supplies that go along with them. Hand grenades, rifle grenades, blasting machine, anti-tank mine. And then we got down here some more of the maybe more personal items for the soldier. Rations of the day, box of Marlboro cigarettes, can't do without them. Variety of cameras, radio equipment. Language books. Whenever soldiers would go to be deployed in an area, they got a guide to the country. They tell them a little bit about the customs, the do's and don'ts, some of the cities, the towns, and a little bit of the language so that at least they could communicate on the basic level with the natives. And then just a variety of other magazines and military manuals. We got a map of the world during the World War II period showing what countries were with who, Allied, Axis, whatever. This is the history of the 299th Combat Engineer Battalion. Tells a little bit of how they got started. They were deactivated temporarily after World War II, but reinstated prior to Vietnam, and it still exists as a military unit today. But also we talk a little bit about the different things that combat engineers are capable of. You name it, if it needed built, it built. They had carpentry sections, plumbing sections, electricians, demolitions teams, building bridges, repairing rail lines and roads. And then this board here has some German paper money mixed between the Nazi Germany, the Reichsmark, and the Rentenmark, which would have been common during the Weimar Republic after World War I. Germany was hit with severe depression. Their money was almost worthless. Well, of course, when Hitler came to power, they changed their monetary system and built the country back up. So that's where you got the Reichsmark. And then some stamps of our friend Adolf Hitler. Unmarked, unstamped. But just an eclectic collection of different items that people can look at and ponder. So give them a little bit of everything.
I'm here representing the Army flight nurses of World War II. Medical area evacuation is really what took off during World War II. Is considered one of the top 5 medical advancements that saved lives. Over the course of 3 years that the flight nurses served, we evacuated over 1,100,000 patients, and we only lost 42 in flight. The benefit of this flight nursing was to be able to get patients out of the battlefield quicker, back to a more stable environment like England or the conquered places in North Africa or Italy, or even back to the United States, where they can get life-saving treatment much, much quicker. Flight nurses originally trained in Bowmansfield, Kentucky, which is in Louisville. It was originally a 4-week course. They were basing it off the flight surgeons who were raised at that time, and it extended to an 8-week course. It covered everything from bivouacking, military, customs, jungle, air, and Arctic medicine, and creating protocols that nurses can do there to deal with any situation, from having to ditch a ship if the plane crashed, how to take care of a patient who started bleeding profusely in flight and they didn't have any blood to give him. Because nurses had to act by themselves. It's really the first time the nurse had 100% autonomy versus going to a doctor. They transported the patients in a variety of planes. The most common one was the C-47 Skytrain. They could have up to 25 ambulatory patients or 18 litter patients. And what I mean by litter patients, they would literally stack the patients 3 to 4 on each side. So if you also look at this picture, that doesn't give the patients a lot of room. That doesn't give the nurses a lot of room to treat them. So how they had to be at the door triaging these patients, putting the most stable in a certain part of the plane, least stable in another part, and having all their injured limbs on the aisle side where the nurse could easily treat them. They had medical kits filled with supplies to be able to treat the patients on board. Again, dealing with anything from pain, anxiety, bleed, even just giving sandwiches and milk, just trying to keep the boys comfortable, because many of these men had never flown before. We also didn't just transport American soldiers, we transported all our allies. We transported German and Japanese POWs. There was one story where we transported an 8-month pregnant Polish soldier. And neither the Polish soldier could not speak English, the nurse could not speak Polish. All she could ask her was, "Are you in pain?" And the entire flight, all she said was no. So all the nurse knows the entire flight, she was not in any pain. So as pertaining to D-Day exactly, 10 MAES, or that's M-A-E-S, that stands for Medical Area Evacuation Squadron, 10 groups of these were sent to England to prepare. Now there were already nurses working around the globe. So I'm going to remind you for just a second. When the Army surgeon authorized flight nurses December 6, 1943. So they were already training in Louisville, Kentucky. Well, what happened during that time? Guadalcanal was being fought for by the U.S. Marine Corps. We were starting to invade North Africa. The first group of nurses were not even allowed to graduate Bowmansfield, so quickly were they sent to opposite sides of the globe to care for our soldiers. Actually, the 802nd group didn't even come back for official training until after the war. They spent their entire time overseas without any official training, but they were constantly sending feedback to people. So just to show that there were already nurses working in every theater for flight nursing, Alaska, CBI, North Africa, Australia, everywhere there were personnel, there were flight nurses as soon as it was safe to go in. So when we sent these people into England, they weren't exactly air evacuating patients from already battle-ridden areas. There were already flight nurses devoted to that. And they would transport people from patients who were, maybe they were stationed in Ireland or Scotland, they got sick, they needed higher medical attention. They would transport them from England. Some even started transporting them from Scotland and Ireland back home to the United States. Very, very tame. But they still had a lot of training to do because they were there since 1943. One of the big things they learned to do was they would help treat casualties from bomber crews as soon as they came off the plane to help give them experience, real firsthand, very critical, very, very deadly trauma patients who needed immediate quick. They also learned how to convert B-17s into patient carriers. This was done in Europe and the Pacific. They could hold about 10 stretchers or 20 patients who could walk, but that was one part of their training while they were overseas. When D-Day started getting closer, they started shipping every patient who was stable enough to fly overseas back to the States. Their job was to empty the hospitals to prepare room for the oncoming casualties. When D-Day happened, flight nurses were not on the ground till 4 days afterwards. So on June 10th is when they actually touched down. They were on Omaha Beach. This one is of a flight nurse who's on the first airstrip built in France. So as soon as possible, these patients are being treated by aid stations. There weren't hospitals on there yet. The flight nurses came in first. Here's the issue. Flight nurses went in on cargo planes. This was one of the most dangerous things a nurse could do because the cargo planes carried war supplies. They could not be protected under the Red Cross. They would fly in on a plane full of supplies, and they did this on D-Day. Ammo, medicine, weapons, men. As soon as the supplies are out, they get the patients in, triage them at the door, and get the patients in on the stretchers. So nurses during D-Day actually did not fly across the channel until they have fighter support. They can make from 2 to 3 trips a day, depending which group. The workload was not evenly distributed among the 10 groups. I found an interview of a nurse who said, sometimes the pilot said, okay, that's enough, we're not flying anywhere today. That didn't mean you were going to go home in England and spend the night. You were spending the night in Normandy. So one guy was nice enough to let her use his foxhole, but she was so scared from all the artillery she didn't sleep. And as soon as though she woke up the next morning, she hightailed it back to the plane. She didn't even wait for breakfast or anything else. She's like, I'm going home. But the amount of casualties they admitted from D-Day, it's still not quite a certain number. They were evacuating patients all the way into the autumn, up to the Battle of the Bulge. I have a couple of numbers here. In July, the 806 Mays transported 6,590 patients that month alone. In September, a different group transported 7,000 patients. So that could be patients who were killed then, who were wounded then, or they were wounded back in Normandy for no reason. They weren't able to be airlifted out. The nurses made a profound impact. Like I said, they only lost 46 patients in the year out of the over 1,100,000 patients they did. Because of their effectiveness in World War II, that's why we have air evacuation today. If you ever had a parent or a friend or a parent of a friend who was saved because he had a heart attack and they flew him in a helicopter to the hospital, that's because of these World War II nurses. They showed that air evacuation had a significant purpose and a very successful way to save lives quicker.
Well, one of my favorite things about these events is talking to all the different reenactors who are so knowledgeable about the people they're portraying. So I'm glad I was able to share some of that with you guys today. That's all for today. I got to get back to the event and get ready to go hit the beach, but I appreciate you guys watching. I'll see you in the next one.